Hi everybody, my name is Sydney West and welcome to my diagnostic support video. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of information about myself. I have a bachelor's degree in early childhood education and currently I'm working on my master's degree in special education. I have a lot of family history with the world of special education as well. I have two cousins with autism spectrum disorder and my mother is a speech language pathologist, so I feel like this is just the world I fit in. So I'm going to get started by giving you three different definitions of autism. We're going to look at them as if it's a triangle. So the bottom layer of our triangle is going to be our most broad definition, and then we're going to work our way up to the tip of the triangle where it's a very precise definition of what ASD is. So to begin with, we're talking about how autism is a developmental disorder that causes significant social, communication, and behavioral challenges. It's often characterized by having deficits in communication for social interaction and restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. As of 2018, the Centers for Disease Control estimate that 1 in 59 children have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and it is 4 times more common among boys than it is girls. So this is the second layer of our triangle. This definition is a bit more detailed, but it's not as specific as it could be. This definition comes from the Georgia Department of Education. They explain that autism is a developmental disability, generally evident before age 3, that adversely affects a student's educational performance and significantly affects developmental rates and sequences, verbal and nonverbal communication, and social interaction participation. So like we said before, we've got the repetitive sequences, nonverbal communication, and then having troubles with the social interaction. Other characteristics that are often associated with autism are unusual responses to sensory experiences, engagement in repetitive activities, and stereotypical movements and resistance to environmental change or change in daily routines. The final layer of our triangle is the very tip top, and this is a very specific definition that comes from the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. These are the first 2 of 5 bullet points. I'm just going to briefly go over them. If you'd like to read over everything that's there, please stop the video so that you can do so. So our first bullet point says that autism spectrum disorder is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by the following. So social emotional, nonverbal communication, and having and maintaining relationships. The second bullet point says that there is repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So this could be speech, this could be activities that are happening, these could be behaviors. They're very repetitive. Moving on to our final 3 bullet points. These still come from the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, the 5th edition. Symptoms must be present in early development period. So typically, by the time a child is 18 months old, a qualified physician will be able to tell you whether or not they have autism. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. So the individual has problems with just functioning in day-to-day life. And these disturbances are not better explained by an intellectual disability or a global developmental delay. Now we're moving on to the tools and strategies for identification and diagnosis. So these assessments and evaluations are utilized by the Georgia Department of Education. Diagnosing autism is based upon behaviors and development since we don't have a real medical test, like a blood test, to use for testing. ASD can be detected as early as 18 months and even younger in some cases. But like I said, between 18 to 24 months, a trained professional is able to give a fairly reliable diagnosis. The Georgia Department of Education utilizes these 5 evaluations. Please be aware that the Department of Education is not responsible for providing a diagnosis. These evaluations are performed to determine the presence of characteristics of ASD. An official diagnosis must be acquired from a doctor. So if we're looking at these 5 tests, we have a comprehensive psychological evaluation, which is a formal assessment of intellectual functioning and an assessment of adaptive behavior. The educational evaluation, which is an assessment of educational performance and current functioning levels. A communication evaluation, which is an assessment of verbal and nonverbal communication. We have behavioral evaluations, which are assessments of social interaction and participation, peer and adult interactions, the capacity to relate to others, stereotypical behaviors, resistance to change, atypical responses to sensory stimuli, persistent preoccupation with or attachment to objects, and any other behaviors that are often associated with ASD. And finally, we have the developmental history. These are developmental differences and delays from the age of onset, which is typically before the age of 3. So a child may be diagnosed as a child with autism spectrum disorder after age 3 if the characteristics of ASD are met. So diagnosis doesn't have to happen by age 3, but typically they happen before. Now, these are the eligibility and placement requirements that the Georgia Department of Education uses. There are 5 of these, and I'm just going to briefly go over them. Developmental rates and sequences are the delays, arrests, and/or inconsistencies in motor, sensory, social, cognitive, or communication skills. So if the child is showing delays in these, those help to determine the eligibility of the child and where that child is going to be placed in the school system. Social interaction and participation. A child displays difficulties and/or idiosyncratic differences in interacting with people and participating in events. Communication, which can be verbal and nonverbal. A child displays a basic deficit in the capacity to use verbal language for social communication. Sensory processing. A child may exhibit unusual, repetitive, or unconventional responses to sensory stimuli. And finally, a repertoire of activities and interests. A child may engage in repetitive activities and/or may display marked distress over changes. So, like I said, these are just eligibility and placement information taken into account by the Georgia Department of Education, but the doctors are the one who have to give the diagnosis. This is just what the county thinks about. The counties think about before they place students. All right, so psychological and behavioral characteristics of ASD. So impaired social communication. This can be communicative intent, joint attention, pragmatics, or the hidden curriculum, which is things we know about, but we weren't necessarily taught. There are repetitive restricted behaviors, such as stereotyped motor or verbal behaviors, and hyper or hyposensitivity. And ASD is a continuum from relatively mild to severe. So it's called autism spectrum disorder. So the spectrum goes from being very mild to extremely severe. Now, these are some more characteristics that go along with autism. I've often used this graphic when teaching students about ASD. It's not an exhaustive list, but they are very common. And from personal experience, these are the characteristics I'm most familiar with. An apparent insensitivity to pain, may not want to cuddle or show emotion, inappropriate attachment to objects, and echoing words or phrases. So like I said, I have 2 cousins with autism, and these are just the characteristics I see from them. But all of these are characteristics that can be used to describe autism. So before we jump straight into the historical issues and trends, I wanted to show you an image. This is a graphic developed by Autism Speaks, one of the world's leading autism advocacy organizations. So from looking at this graph, we can see that there's been a major increase in the prevalence of autism since the 1970s. In 1975, the prevalence was 1 in 5,000, making autism still a rare occurrence. By 1985, this number has been halved, and then this trend continues to move as we go on into the 90s and the 2000s. But this graph only goes to 2009, which was nearly a decade ago. This is an updated graph. This year, a new graph was created with updated information from the Centers for Disease Control. The trend from before has continued, and today 1 in 59 children will be diagnosed with autism. Seeing the increase in prevalence over the past 4 decades will help you to have a better understanding of some of the historical issues and trends that we're about to cover. In a Different Key, The Story of Autism is a book that was written by authors John Donovan and Karen Zucker, where they dive into the history of autism spectrum disorder. The book is divided into 10 parts that cover really everything you need to know about the history of autism, from the first child diagnosed to today's understandings. So on this slide, I just included a couple chapters, and I'm just going to do a brief overview of what's happening in them. So the Refrigerator Mother is a chapter that talks about how at one point it was believed that children were autistic because they had no love from their mothers and fathers. Finding Their Marbles talks about how different theories that were used during this time to explain why autism is a thing, where it came from. The Autism Spectrum details how the term autism spectrum came to be. The vaccine scare is probably one of the most controversial topics related to autism. The big question is, do vaccines cause autism? This entire topic began in 1998 when an article in London newspaper claimed that vaccines were the cause of autism. Turns out this is not such. The person who made these statements was not a proper doctor. He did not have the proper scientific evidence, but the damage was already done. And then finally, this chapter talks about the greatest fraud. So this chapter continues to follow the story of Andrew Wakefield, the man who originally came up with the vaccine idea. And it talks about those who agree and disagree with his opinion. At one point, he lost his medical license due to this. However, many people still believe that vaccines cause autism. So over the years, the beliefs and everything, the trends going along with autism have changed from believing that mothers and fathers weren't loving their children to vaccines caused it. Until still today, there's no definite idea of what exactly causes autism. So now we're going to move on to perspectives of individuals with ASD. More often than not, the individuals who speak on ASD have not been diagnosed with the disorder. Their parents and friends and doctors and researchers who know a lot about ASD, but they're not those people. So I have 2 individuals here, 2 ladies that I'm going to do a little brief discussion on. To the left, we have Temple Grandin, who is perhaps the most famous woman in the world of ASD. She wasn't formally diagnosed with autism until later in her life, but during her early years, her mother made a connection between her behaviors and the characteristics of autism. She describes individuals with ASD as being visual, pattern, and verbal thinkers. She also talks about how she sees finer details more than the big picture, and she uses this to her benefit working in the cattle industry. And on the right, we have Rosie King, who is a relatively young girl who asks the question of why be normal. As a young woman with autism, King has dealt with a lot of stereotyping due to her disorder, and at the age of 16, she was able to stand in front of people and to give her story. People are so afraid of variety that they try and force everyone, even people who don't want to or can't, to become normal. So that's a pretty big opinion from both of them. And finally, we're moving on to approaches to intervention and treatment. So the interventions and treatments are as unique as the individuals that have autism. These are just some that have been proven to be effective, but you need to discuss with the people, with parents, if it's a child in this case, on what treatments are most beneficial. So for school-age children, we use visual supports, keeping instructions simple, teaching social skills, choice and alternative activities, positive reinforcement, and building relationships. And with adults, we typically do therapy services, which can be speech, physical, or occupational, social skills training, and behavioral support. So like I said, each individual is different and it changes for each person. And then I move on to my reference list that you can pause if you'd like to see. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you were able to learn something new, and I hope you have a fabulous day. Bye-bye.